What if your fertility journey wasn't just about getting pregnant, but about being the most connected and resilient version of yourself? Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show. I'm your host, Dr. Amy, and today I have the joy of welcoming Dr. Larisa Corda, an internationally recognized fertility specialist, obstetrician-gynecologist, and the visionary behind the conception plan to the show. Dr. Corda's integrative approach to reproductive health has been featured on ITV's This Morning and in Harper's Bazaar, Mary Claire, and more. What sets her apart is her deep commitment to treating the whole person, not just their diagnosis. Through her 5-pillar framework, the conception plan, she empowers people to reclaim their fertility journeys by addressing nutrition, exercise, stress management, toxin-free living, and sex and relationships. Welcome, Larisa. I'm so excited to have you on. Thank you for joining me
Oh,
today.
thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be on your podcast and to be having this transatlantic conversation. It's really exciting for me.
Same here. I'm so glad you're here. And I love the conception plan. It's everything that I want for my patients.
Oh,
Can you start by sharing about how you got into reproductive medicine and what inspired you to develop it?
mhm. Thank you so much, Amy. It always touches me when other healthcare practitioners and healers feel that actually the conception plan speaks to them and their patients. So, how did I get into reproductive medicine? Back in 2009, when I was a really junior doctor, I remember being asked by a senior colleague of mine who was at the time editing a book. And he assigned a chapter to me, and that chapter was all about older age motherhood. And we called it Biopanic, the rise of older age women having children. And he asked me to research and to write this chapter. And there was just something about doing that research that made me realize, oh my goodness, this is the future. And this is what so many people are going to be facing and having to deal with. And it's going to change our societies. It's going to have huge repercussions for lots and lots of people, lots of families, transgenerational effects. And I just found it all so incredibly interesting. That was probably the beginning of me going down that whole reproductive route. But at the same time, what was happening in tandem is that I've always been quite a bohemian sort of person. And as well as growing up in a scientific household, I've grown up in a very artistic bohemian home too. So for me, merging these two worlds of science and spirit has always been quite natural. As I sort of grew more as a doctor and understood scientific principles a lot more, I started to be amazed at how science and spirit could come together, especially when it came to reproduction and conception, which really, I don't know if you'll agree with me here, but sits at that incredible interface between spirit and spirit coming into matter and into shape and into form. And that really, really intrigued me and made me want to explore further and go down lots of different rabbit holes. So it was the combination of what was a lot of research and writing for this book, combined with my natural spiritual curiosities, that made me realize that the world of reproductive medicine, I think for me, brings those two worlds together and marries them more than any other part in medicine. And that was
Right.
ultimately what inspired me to go down
Yeah,
that
and
route.
it's so true. I mean, our patients are on a deeply spiritual journey, and it's unlike any other medical
Mhm.
condition. I mean, when you go see your diabetes doctor, you're not thinking about religion, how you were raised, your relationship with your partner, sex. It's so different from anything else in medicine,
Yeah.
and you just put it into such beautiful words. And so the conception plan is going to really change the lives of so many people because you're putting into words things that people already are thinking,
Mhm.
but no one has created this framework for them. So I think it's quite exceptional. So
Mhm.
talk to us about how it supports people emotionally, physically, and spiritually.
When I set out to write this book and when the concepts were first coming together prior to the book taking form, I was aware that the medical lens with which we view people is just so restricted and so limited. We purely focus on what we see in front of us. And we don't necessarily consider that there is so much more going on beyond the physical, beyond the conscious. and what people can necessarily articulate and understand on the mental level. And seeing lots of different patients, I began to realize that so much of what they didn't tell me, what they weren't necessarily aware of, what was going on at the subconscious, was actually at the root of what was creating some of the problems in the first place. And that the struggle to become pregnant was actually a big metaphor for lots of different wounding patterns that were going on underneath the surface, where there were emotional challenges, where there was trauma that needed to be explored and excavated, where the subconscious needed to be made conscious and people just weren't aware of it. And modern Western medical routes just don't have any scope to, at the moment, accommodate that. Even though current research says otherwise, especially all of the things and research we hear about trauma, for example. So the conception plan was my attempt to bring something into the world that really amalgamated all of these different concepts, some of them esoteric and alternative, into scientific principles, and to explain through that scientific lens why so many of these spiritual concepts that have been around for so many generations and why they belong in modern medicine. We have a role as modern healthcare practitioners to integrate those and to give the very best to our patients. So that was the reason why I ultimately developed the concepts and then went on to write the book to make it as accessible as I could.
I was listening to some of your interviews and I said, we need women here to learn about what these pillars are. And I want to get into those 5 pillars: psychology, environment, diet, exercise, and spirituality. Can you talk about how they work together and why they matter so much in the context of fertility?
What I really love people to appreciate most about the 5 pillars in my book, which are
Got it.
nutrition, exercise, stress management, toxin-free living, so reducing the chemical load in our environments, and then sex and relationships, is how they interrelate. It's about addressing all of these different aspects at the same time. So not just focusing on one, but working in tandem with all of them, because all of them get to have an epigenetic effect. They get to control how our genes and our cells behave, and ultimately whether disease gets to express in the first place or not. And I would say nutrition is one of the most important ones, because what we eat and how we feed ourselves does literally translate down to the level of our genes. You know, it's something that's directly accessible for all of us, even though good, nutritious food still remains very inaccessible for a lot of people around the world. But it should be the norm that we get to eat food which has been produced in a way where it hasn't been adulterated by so many different chemicals and synthetics and processed, that remains nutrient dense and that ultimately feeds the inner core of who we are. Exercise is a really important one as well, for perhaps obvious reasons that people may relate to BMI. But it also has a really big influence on metabolism, inflammation, estrogen dominance, hormonal balance, and then mitochondrial function as well. But the one that might surprise people is stress management, because traditionally, a lot of doctors are taught that stress doesn't really have a big impact when it comes to our health, and we tend to underestimate it. And so do our patients. When a new client first comes to see me and I start talking to them about stress, most of them come in and tell me they're not stressed. You know, they don't believe that that's something that's impacting them. And after they've spent an hour or two consultation with me, it becomes really clear that there's a whole lot going on under the surface, and a lot of stress that is just being covered and managed in a way that's keeping that person functional. But actually, there's a whole lot of trauma and many dysregulated patterns of behavior that the person may have either inherited or acquired as a result of experiences, especially those that have shaped their childhood, which remain unprocessed, but which directly impact how our cells express, the emotions that are running within our bodies, and how ultimately our cells are behaving in response to that. So stress directly feeds into this idea of our neural wiring having a direct impact on our epigenome, and also the new concept of psychoneuroimmunology, and how our psychology and what's going on at the emotional and mental level directly influences our neurology, immunology, endocrinology, and all the other biological systems in the body. Toxin-free living and reducing the chemical load in our environments is one that there's a growing a number of research papers about, and we're suddenly realizing we do actually live in environments are inundated with lots and lots of toxins that are affecting not just us, but also the babies that are being born on the other end. The placenta actually stores a lot of these toxins, and it's something that babies come into direct contact with if we're not careful about managing that load and impact. Some of those toxins can be found in the most innocuous products like shampoos and conditioners, and they don't come with any warning label about being endocrine disruptors. And then the last one, sex and relationships. A lot of people will no doubt understand that the relationship with the other person that they're conceiving with is important. One of the most important things about becoming pregnant is the relationship you have with yourself. You know, if you are naturally attempting to conceive, the kind of sex that you're having really does matter, where it isn't just about the mechanics behind it, which is what most doctors will focus on. How many times are you having sex in a week or in a month? It's so much more than that. It's the whole context behind how sex occurs and what happens, and this incredible energetic and biochemical exchange that also goes on, which directly shapes the epigenome of the baby that's born on the other end.
I mean, I could talk about this all day. I mean, I want my patients to have amazing, mind-blowing sex, right? I mean, I want them to really enjoy it.
Right.
But the reality is they're so stressed
Yeah.
out that it just becomes so
Yeah.
mechanical.
Yeah.
I'm glad you emphasize
Yeah.
that. And you emphasize including partners as well when a couple is trying to
Mm.
conceive. And how can that change a couple's experience and outcomes if they're approaching it together?
Well, I think it's really important they approach it together. I feel that women take on a lot of that burden. And that's also to do with this societal distortion that we have, which doesn't really talk about what men are struggling with, and that they are also facing a huge epidemic and crisis in terms of their sperm counts and abnormalities. Just in the last 40 years alone, sperm counts have halved. And we know that up to 50% of infertility in a heterosexual couple can be attributed to male factor. And therefore, it's really vital that both people who are attempting to conceive are included in the healing and the treatment that goes on. But even if the other person isn't necessarily affected, shall we say, on a physical level, it's really important that they understand that whole process and are there to support the partner in their life in what is a hugely transformative experience that will have an impact on both of them, as well as the child that they're bringing into the world.
I agree. Men are showing up. They're showing up and they're asking, like, what else can I do? What can I do to help? And I think they can approach their partner's conception plan in the same way by recognizing how important the pillars are for themselves as well.
And there's a section in the book which focuses on male related conditions. There's a complete underappreciation that low sperm counts or abnormalities with sperm are a barometer when it comes to general health related to that man. So if there is an issue in terms of conceiving due to male factor, there might be more of a chronic predisposition later on in life towards cancer, towards diabetes, stroke, all of these conditions that we who are practicing in the reproductive field, we get to teach the men to understand that actually, if they're able to improve their sperm counts and improve their sperm overall, then that will have a direct positive benefit for them as well as the children that are born. And we're seeing another epidemic of testicular dysgenesis syndrome. And this sort of triple whammy of sperm abnormalities, along with a rise in testicular cancer and more genitourinary abnormalities. And I don't think that's a coincidence. You know, I think
Yeah.
all three are interrelated and often to do with problems in these five pillars that I've mentioned, feeding into the physical level. And I think that they're expressing far more in men and predisposing them to chronic health conditions later in life that we have a real opportunity to potentially stop or at least alleviate.
Such great points, especially because so many of our patients, they haven't had that many interactions with healthcare providers in their life. Oftentimes they're seeing us, and the first time they're even undergoing anesthesia is in an egg retrieval. And so their first interactions or having medical experiences are as fertility patients. So I tell my patients, look, you want to have a baby, you want to live as long as possible. You want to take incredible care of yourself so that you can be here to see your grandchildren. And so your points are all very well taken. And you said something early on as far as like why you wrote the book, and you wrote that first chapter, and there was a term that you used. What was it?
Yes.
Biopanic. And so many, and I was like, oh my God, that you just coined a phrase like egg panic.
Mm,
Like so many
yeah.
patients, they have
Mhm.
this, like literally, it's like an anxiety disorder.
Yeah.
There should be a new diagnosis of egg panic. And that's
Mm,
what so many of my patients feel, especially because my patient population tends to be over
yeah.
40, and they come in with egg panic.
Yeah.
And so they're also overwhelmed by this pressure
Mhm.
to get it all
Yeah.
right when trying to conceive.
Mhm.
So, how does your plan relieve some of that egg
Mm.
panic so people can let go of the perfectionism
Mm.
and instead find some peace in their
Mm.
journey?
I think that's a really important point, actually. The way I actually view conceiving after the age of 40 is quite different to many other doctors. I don't believe in the concept of making women panic over the fact that they are slightly older. Sure, we all know that the number of eggs that a woman has with age declines, and that the integrity of the DNA also starts to decline. But what we do get to control and what we do get to teach people is how to slow down the rate of that aging through being able to have an impact on the epigenome. That's really, really important, because we do have the science and we do have the research to suggest that actually there is a whole lot that we can do to extend fertile windows. I believe in empowering women to have children whenever they feel they want to do that. Again, we know from recent research that actually AMH is a really poor biomarker and indicator of live birth rates. And I think that's a conversation that we need to be having a lot more often. Plus, as well as discussing all of the positive benefits of having children later in life. We know that women who have children over the age of 40 tend to live longer, tend to live over the age of 90 compared to the general population. We know that also the children born on the other end have higher emotional IQs. So there are a lot of positives to this, and I think we should be supporting people to make those decisions and choices when they feel ready. But in terms of removing some of those anxieties, everything I talk about is about reclaiming that power yourself and being able to seize a level of control in amongst all of that chaos, and understand that everything that you do with regards to committing to the plan, which I say should be at least 3 months, but ideally longer. So even if you're someone who's going down the IVF route or having IUI, it doesn't matter. What you invest in terms of those eggs and sperm and in your own general health is really vital, because it's going to give you a better outcome. It's potentially going to mean you don't need so many IVF cycles or retrievals. And ultimately, it's going to mean better health for your child. These effects are transgenerational. So, what a lot of people might consider as 3 months of wasted time that they don't have, is actually incredibly important, because it's when you're building that scaffolding, that foundation, which will shape everything else in terms of your conception journey, and might actually give you the best possible chance of having an entirely natural conception.
And then if someone's, let's say, going through IVF right now, how can they build the pillars into their current treatment? Do
Well,
that.
just the same as anyone who's trying naturally. If this is completely new work that someone hasn't done before and it's the first time they're coming across it, then I would speak to your doctor about it. But, depending on individual circumstances, it might even be a good idea to postpone treatment until you've done 3 months of preparation, and making sure that your womb environment and the eggs and the sperm are as optimized as they can possibly be prior to that conception taking place. But if you are someone who's already well versed in doing that, who's already been practicing some of these methods, then it's something that, you can absolutely do alongside your treatment and integrate those practices as much as possible. I'm sure you've had encounters as well. Lots of IVF clinics are now incorporating nutritionists, acupuncturists, healers, therapists of some sort to help their clients, because there is real value in doing this work alongside any treatment that you might be having.
For the spirituality piece, some people, it could be intimidating for them, especially if it's foreign to them. How can they become more spiritual? How would you recommend someone do that if it's just not something that comes naturally to them?
There was recent research that was asking people a certain questions to determine how spiritual they actually were. And the response was quite incredible in that I think more than 70% of the population is actually spiritual but doesn't realize that. So when we talk about being spiritual, we're not talking about being religious. These two terms are not the same. When we talk about being spiritual, the best way I can describe it is understanding that we are interconnected in terms of not just the different systems that run between us, which I mentioned before are biological and energetic, but we're also interconnected with the world that we exist in, and that the context behind becoming pregnant and conception is so much bigger than just the physical one. I say to people that when they talk about fertility, it isn't just about the focus on having a child. It is about being able to transform from one state of being into another, and to be able to understand that there is a flow in that, that there are lots of different healing modalities that we can deploy within ourselves to be able to shift us from states of wounding that manifest disease and that manifest various different expressions within the body towards ones of health. Because ultimately, as human beings, we exist in a state of polarity. And by that, I mean that often pain and trauma are deep sources of growth, if we can recognize them as that. And they are the places where we stand to gain the most and where so many of our gifts are hidden. And when we start to understand that, working with that concept and unearthing some of this wounding that we might have inherited and being able to reshape that into a state of health and healing is ultimately a spiritual concept, right? Because we bring so many different spiritual elements to that. And that's when we get to change, that's when we get to transform. And that's when we get to understand that we are so much more than just physical beings, that we have an aura, that we have a bioenergetic field, that our emotions are there as more than just physical expressions, that they are also energetic and vibrational too. It's complex, but I think ultimately many people, it's not that they need to necessarily understand what spirituality is. I think all they need is an open mind to appreciate that actually there are so many, as one of my patients put it beautifully and said, it's just this understanding that there's something so much bigger than us going on with this whole
Yeah.
process.
Yeah.
And that's all we need to understand, and be open to whatever comes through.
Right. And transformation is huge in our
Yeah.
patients. Going from struggling to then pregnant, they transform. And then the pictures our patients send
Yeah.
us when they're mothers, they're like different
Yeah.
people, completely transformed. It's incredible
It
to
is,
see.
because I think parenthood
Yeah.
is the biggest spiritual assignment, that exists. It really, really is. And exactly as you said, that transformation that we get to witness, have the honor of witnessing, is just so profoundly incredible.
Yeah. I'd love for you to talk about some of the most powerful shifts that you've seen in your patients, if you can share some.
What I notice with people is that as they start to do this healing, which takes time. This isn't something that's just going to happen overnight. This usually requires the space of sometimes even many months, years, to actually really sort of come into your own and understand who you are as this complex human being. It's the way that so many things change for them. They start to react differently to certain situations. Their perception starts to change, where they start to wear different colored clothes. You might be surprised, but so many of them actually change jobs entirely because they realize, actually, I really don't like that job and I don't know why I'm doing it. And I don't feel like I'm in true alignment with myself. Because they develop the most authentic version of themselves, it then becomes very difficult to hold down a job or a career that you're not really connected to, or to hold down friendships that suddenly start to seem as if they're not really in alignment with who you are, or people who don't necessarily connect with you anymore when you start to undergo this transformation. Borrowing a term from one of my patients, one of them said to me, ultimately the biggest thing she learned was how to parent herself, something
Mm.
that she had always struggled with because she never really received what she needed to as a child. And for me, I have noticed that so many of the patients that I work with often have a lot of inner child trauma and issues that's never been dealt with, it's never been recognized. They've never had the support to deal with it. And it's almost like the presentation of infertility throws down this gauntlet for transformation and allows them
Right.
to go on this inner journey of healing, which is truly, truly incredible to witness. And when people start to make that soul connection within themselves, they really not only start to act differently, but perceive things differently, think differently, react differently, and they start to engage their extrasensory perceptions, which is an incredible thing that we don't talk a lot about in medicine. There's one couple that I worked with for about 18 months. And the guy, towards the end, starting to talk about past lives himself, just off his own volition. And I looked at him, just look at you compared to when you started. You just thought all of this stuff was a little bit out there, and what on earth were you doing sitting in this office and talking about this? But he himself was then bringing up these highly spiritual subjects and themes, which was just amazing. We all found it quite funny how far he had actually come and just what a transformation he had undergone. It's beautiful to
Yeah.
see, and I love watching
Yeah.
it.
And the transformation, even if it's not before a pregnancy occurs, it allows patients to speak up for
Yeah.
themselves, to
Yes.
advocate for themselves, so they're less traumatized as they go through treatment and less angry
Yes.
about potential things that may have been missed in the clinic, because then they aren't scared. I think so many of our patients are scared. They want to behave. They want to behave well for the doctor. But those patients who know themselves the most
Mm,
and they speak their truth as they're going through treatment, I think they're the ones that do the best.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
my patients who send me an email and they say, "I'm so sorry. I apologize." I say, "We don't do that here. You don't
Mm,
apologize for
mm,
asking me a question and asking me to
mm,
consider something else." Like, I welcome that,
yeah.
and they're not used to it.
Yeah, and that's so beautiful,
Yeah.
Amy. I love that. And you make such a powerful point about it, because I think when someone grows in their level of self-awareness and starts to look at things with a different level of perception, they stop seeing things as happening to them, and they start to
Mhm.
realize that actually that evolution that they're undergoing as a human being has to some extent invited an experience in order to help them to grow and to become this incredible human being that they were always destined to be, and to help them
Yeah.
to grow in their power, in their level of compassion. And I think some of the best parents are those people who actually face the greatest hardships,
Yeah.
because it's those hardships that mold and shape them into the incredibly strong, finely attuned, self-aware parents who have stepped into that spiritual assignment, who have done the work, who have done the healing,
Right.
and who've taken on a level of accountability to say, actually, I'm going to resolve these things within myself before it starts to affect another generation. And so that I
Right.
can be the healthiest version of myself possible, and so can my child.
And so many of our patients, they don't think they're deserving
Yeah.
yet. They don't see themselves as the incredible human
Mm.
being that we see them
Yeah.
as. So when I meet someone for the first time, as I'm sure you do, you see them
Mm.
as
Yeah.
incredible. Looking ahead, I'd love to hear what you think the future of fertility care holds for us. How do you see it evolving?
I think there should be an emphasis on now being able to bring a truly integrated and holistic approach, a holism to conception care, to reproductive care. Actually, I'd argue and say the entire women's care that we practice all around the world, because we know that actually so many of these concepts do make a very real difference. We know that when patients go out and seek alternative complementary therapies, they more often than not really help, and more people are finding that out for themselves. So I think we have a responsibility to educate ourselves. Let's face it, modern medicine doesn't take that into account. It doesn't even really properly teach us about nutrition. So a lot of us do have to take that work on board as an extra, or at least be able to understand the role and value of people and healers and experts who are able to practice in those fields and integrate them within modern medicine. So I think that the shift and the move should be towards holism, rather than actually what we're seeing at the moment, which is the focus on AI technologies and the impact it's going to have on reproductive medicine. And sure, they're is a role for that if we understand how to use it conscientiously and practice it with a level of evolved consciousness. But that takes time. And at the moment, we're not there. If we don't use those technologies properly, then we are in real danger of transhumanism and potentially outsourcing the entire process of conception to something that's purely mechanical, that lacks any level of emotion, and that ultimately isn't human. And I think that for me is worrying. We have to be able to use our discernment. We have to be able to have these conversations, and we have to be able to understand that actually the most important technologies that we will ever have in this world, beyond our extended lifetimes, is within us.
Right.
Is ultimately
Right.
within us. And we have all of those resources. It's just that many of us haven't been taught how to use them at all.
Right.
And we've spent our entire lives outsourcing that, whether it's to medical pills or to various different other treatments, which have a role, of course, but they cannot replace what we can ultimately do ourselves. And I think we need to be
Yeah.
able to, we need to shift that focus on being able to understand that better. And, final point on this is when we talk about the placebo effect as doctors, and this is really interesting because so much of the time we dismiss things, oh, it's just a placebo. And whenever people say that, I always think, what do you mean it's just a placebo? If a person can literally think themselves into recovering or into a version of health without requiring the medical input, isn't that phenomenal? I mean, what's going
Yeah.
on there? Why are we not researching that? Why are we not trying to understand what they're actually doing and
Right.
how they're managing that? How they're literally reprogramming their epigenome and their neurological wiring to be able to, for their cells to express and behave in a different way. I think that's phenomenal. And
Yeah.
I can never understand why people call it just the placebo. It's so much
Right.
more than
Right.
that. It's huge.
So I'm hoping that you will also say the future of fertility care is conception plan workshops where
Uh,
people can sign up for a 12-week workshop, be in cohorts, run by you. I'm sure you don't have the time, or people that you trust. Is that in the
well, this is
works?
exactly what I'm making the time for. So you read my mind.
Oh, I love it.
Absolutely. I have literally just in the last few weeks launched the conception plan program, which is exactly what
Awesome.
you've said. You down to a T. So it's a 12-week online coaching program because I wanted to make this work accessible to everyone, no matter where they live around the world, with some incredible coaches who are going to be delivering on all of the main pillars of my plan and training and coaching people within cohorts to be able to really apply these principles that I talk about. And in particular, with there being this focus on the emotional and mental impact of what's going on for the particular client and how they can change the trajectory of that. So it's something that has spawned and grown from the book. So it's for those people who want to go a little bit deeper, and I am so excited to be able to share it and offer it to people. And they can go on the Conception Plan website to find out more and apply.
So what about for patients who want to see you as a patient? How can they find you?
On the website, theconceptionplan.com, I answer every single email that people send to me at support at the Conception Plan. People might ask how to get the book. At the moment, it's online ordering through Amazon. And please email me, if you've read the book, or DM me on Instagram. I'm at Dr. Larisa Corda. I love hearing these stories, and the more people we get talking about it and demanding this kind of approach to their health and conception, I think that the greater the chance that ultimately this will come and be disseminated to various parts of the world.
I'm so glad you came on today. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you so much,
I
Amy.
do.
Everything you are doing for your patients, even just having this podcast and taking time out, is such an amazing thing. And you are such a
Yeah.
professional and an incredibly caring and kind person. And I can only imagine the benefit that all your patients get to have with having you as their doctor.
Dr. Corda, thank you so much for this beautiful and soul-filled conversation. Your work is such a gift to this field and to anyone navigating the complexity of trying to conceive with more grace, intention, and hope. If this episode resonated with you, be sure to subscribe to the Egg Whisperer Show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you know someone who's on this journey and could use support, encouragement, or a fresh perspective, please share this episode with them. Because fertility isn't just a physical journey. It touches your heart, your hopes, and your vision for the future. And you deserve support every step of the way. Thank you, Larisa.
Thank you
I
so
really
much.
appreciate it.